Families at the Border, the FBI report, and the Trump Foundation. I'm Adam Byrne, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Adam Byrne. Joining us today are political reporter James Rosen, Michael Shindler of Young Voices, and contract attorney Benita Talati. Welcome, everyone. This week, the controversy over families being separated at the US-Mexico border reached a fever pitch before President Trump reversed course with an executive order ending the practice. Here's the president explaining his actions.
We're signing an executive order I consider to be a very important executive order. It's about keeping families together while at the same time being sure that we have a very powerful, very strong border, and border security will be equal, if not greater, than previously. So we're going to have strong, very strong borders, but we're going to keep the families together. I didn't like the sight or the feeling of families being separated.
So, Michael Shindler, how much credit does President Trump get for solving a problem his administration created?
Well, I wouldn't say that he created this problem. In fact, if you were to credit any president with this unique situation, you would credit Bill Clinton. Because what's happening now is due to the Flores Agreement, which was a landmark court settlement in 1997, which decided that we couldn't hold children with their families in detention for longer than 20 days. Well, what we can do is say that President Trump has done the first thing that any president has done to help solve this situation, though this executive order hasn't actually solved it quite yet. We need either a new ruling from the court or new legislation from Congress.
Which part of the Flores settlement says that you have to separate children from their parents?
It was within the text of the court settlement. I don't have the exact section, but it's there.
Well, the settlement, I believe, says that, yes, you're right that you can't keep children in detention for a certain time, but it doesn't say you have to split them up with their parents. Benita Talati, where do you stand on this issue?
So I do agree with Michael that the Flores consent decree is there. Where I disagree is that we have to separate families. The problem with this is that we don't know where the children are, where the parents are. There is no guarantee that these parents and these children will be reunited. They're right now scattered all over the country, and there's absolutely no way of keeping track of who's where.
So James Rosen, what do you think to this point that President Trump's the first president to clean this situation up?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure he cleaned the situation up. There's a lot of ironies here. President Obama, during his 8 years, deported about twice as many illegal immigrants as his immediate predecessor, President Bush. And it didn't get a lot of attention because President Obama, in typical fashion, didn't hold news conferences and say wild things. He just kind of did it quietly. And President Trump, what's interesting about this is that he shows a real knack for public relations sometimes, and that he really understands public relations. And I think this is one situation where it's just amazing that he didn't. Everybody says optics. It's just amazing that it took him a couple of days, 3 days, more than that, whatever it was, to understand that he had to undo this. His kind of instincts have been better than that before.
Has this been a political problem for the president?
I think this has been an optics problem. But even then, I'd like to stress that this really isn't a presidential problem. This is a congressional problem. This executive order isn't going to fix things in the long term. At most, it'll last for about 3 weeks until it's challenged. And at that point, either congressional legislation will be passed or it won't be, and we'll be stuck in the same problem that we were a few days ago. Either that or the courts will have to overturn Flores.
I'm just curious, President Trump had an impromptu press conference outside the White House with reporters gathered around him. where he said that an executive order couldn't possibly fix this problem and that it had to be Congress. So why did he then just fix it with an executive order?
It isn't fixed with the executive order. This is a 3-week stopgap.
But the practice specifically of separating the children from their parents, that's what the executive order was targeted at stopping, even though his administration started that policy in the beginning of April, I think it was.
Yes.
Well, what it does at most is it stops the separation, but it doesn't stop the what's it called? It doesn't stop the requirement to what's it called? To not be allowed to hold children like past 20 days in detention facilities. This isn't a fix. This isn't a grand solution. What's necessary is bipartisan legislative aid.
Okay, so Benita, I think today the Trump administration was going to court to try and change the Flores settlement that we've been discussing to allow parents and their children to be detained for longer than the 20-day limit. Do you think that's the answer?
Well, again, the problem is what Michael said is true, that it will take an act of Congress, actually, to undo Flores. As an attorney, I can state unequivocally that immigration is within the ambit of Congress. Congress is the one that has to do something. Executive orders can't do anything, unfortunately. And yes, I believe New York is already filing a lawsuit challenging this because Flores is currently the stated law.
Okay. And
I think what's fascinating about this is, I would say over the last 20 years, maybe 30 years, we've seen presidents acquire more and more power, or take power out. And one of the ways they've exercised this is through executive orders. And I think that has happened because as Congress has become more and more polarized, more and more partisan, first of all, it's much harder for them to work together and compromise, but they also don't want to tackle the tough issues because the representatives have to run every 2 years. One example of that is DACA, the Dreamers Act. President Obama started that on his own. I can't remember if he signed an executive order. I assume he did.
I think it was.
Okay, but he started that on his own, and then President Trump came in and said, "Hey, you, Congress, you got to fix this." And President Trump actually is right, but Congress has been reneging on a lot of its responsibilities for years now. They don't want to make the tough choices, and that creates a vacuum where Democratic and Republican presidents have stepped in.
Yeah, so where do you see Congress going for? Because to James's point, there was a bill, it looked like today, that they've shelved because some of the more conservative members of the House don't want to vote on a fix for DACA, for the so-called Dreamers.
Part of the problem is the fact that this is an election year. November is coming. They know that there's a blue wave likely to come. So that's part of the reason why they just can't seem to do anything. It's unfortunate that Congress is just not acting, and I think it's going to take something. I'm not sure quite yet what it's going to take, but it is going to take some extraordinary act, something, to make Congress move. I don't know if maybe term limits might be the solution here. I just don't know.
What's the answer for you, Michael?
I think the horror with what's going on in Congress right now is that they're taking what could be a very, very small, narrowly defined piece of legislation, and they're refusing to vote on it, and instead they take that piece of legislation and they lump it into a gigantic basket of things, for example, like funding for the border wall, a solution for Dreamers, all in one giant bill that nobody's going to agree with. If instead they had decided to propose and vote on one small, narrowly defined bill that would address this one problem, I am sure that could have gone through the House and even possibly through the Senate.
Yeah, I think that's what they were trying today. It was just an immigration bill on its own, but is it the different factions within the Republican Party? I think one thing was interesting, the administration were saying, well, only Congress can fix this. Well, the Republican Party controls Congress.
Right. Well, that's kind of been the irony for some years now. The Republican Party is very divided. But I think what both parties do now is they use these inflammatory issues to run on in the next election. And so the Democrats, if there's a Republican president, the Democrats don't cooperate. If there's a Democratic president, the Republicans don't cooperate. I can't remember a single instance. I'm sure on smaller bills there were instances, but on major legislation, during the 8 years that President Obama was president, not only did he not get any Republican cooperation, there were cases, the stimulus bill, the health care bill, where there was not a single Republican vote for. I think the stimulus bill got 3 Republican votes. Now, whatever you thought of it, it wasn't that outrageous.
Okay.
And
Well,
so they're doing it for political reasons.
yeah,
Both
okay.
parties.
Well, I suspect we'll be revisiting this issue. But for now, I'd like to remind our viewers that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, or via Facebook or Twitter, and we'll answer as many as we can live on air towards the end of the show. Another big story over the last week is the FBI Inspector General's report on the agency's handling of the Hillary Clinton email investigation. Here's FBI Director Christopher Wray.
There's some sobering lessons in there, and we're going to learn those lessons, and we're going to act on those lessons, and that's the way the FBI has always handled these things in the past, and that's what made the FBI stronger over the last 110 years.
So, James Rosen, does this report show that there's a deep state within the FBI out to get President Trump?
Well, I think it shows clearly that there's a bunch of agents who don't like President Trump. If they, whether they add up to a deep state, I mean, it might be a state of 1,000 people or 500 people, or I mean, in any major agency, I think FBI has several 100,000 people. You're going to find people who love President Trump, hate Hillary Clinton, and vice versa. What made this different is that their private comments and texts normally don't get broadcast around the world. And you know, I kind of agree with the Trump supporters who say that you know, the remarks clearly indicate some of the remarks that were made clearly indicated an anti-Trump feeling, and yet concluded there was no bias. But it's kind of the opposite of what happened with Hillary, where, you know, before the election, where there were things that were done. You know, some of the stuff that Comey did, the two, you know, saying she was horrible and negligent, but he's not going to bring charges. Then 10 days before, saying, "Oh yeah, I'm looking at her emails again," that the Democrats and her supporters think cost them the election. So this is just a continuation of the argument that's been going on in this country since Election Day, which is, you know, did the FBI cost Hillary the election, or did the FBI cost Trump the election? There's arguments to me on both sides. One of the things I find fascinating is, I at least think of FBI agents, and maybe this is a gross generalization, as being generally conservative, as I think of most law enforcement people. And it's interesting to find out, you know, there's some liberals in high places working for the FBI. It's kind of counterintuitive. But, you know, the comments were very snarky that were made. And Mr. Strzok, if I'm pronouncing his name right, I believe he left the FBI very recently.
You know, he's still there.
He's still there?
The other agent he was having a relationship with left the FBI.
Okay, I'm
Peter Strzok is still there, but he's been removed from the Trump investigation
he
by
was
Robert Mueller.
Yeah, yes, but he was also, after that, he was demoted.
Yeah.
He was given a lower position. And so the whole thing's just fascinating. You know, it is a little bothersome to, whatever you think of the president, it is a little bothersome to see senior FBI officials charged with investigating Hillary Clinton's email expressing such animus toward Donald Trump.
Okay. Benita Talati, how troubled were you by that aspect of this report?
I was very troubled, actually. I mean, it shows that all the way to the higher levels of government, to our law enforcement agencies, there's a lot of bias out there against our own president. I mean, this report shows that there's so much bias, and it shows that there's a lot of animosity towards our president. And it shows, frankly, that there's no point anymore in even having the Russia investigation, quite frankly. Again and again and again, it just seems like it's a pattern of people going after Trump, no matter what. It shows that it's everywhere, not just ordinary citizens, but also in government, in our law enforcement agencies, everything.
So the report, while it acknowledged the problematic optics of these text messages, said that they didn't actually have any impact, that those views by those two agents didn't actually have any impact on the investigations into either Hillary Clinton or Trump or anyone else. So aren't these two agents allowed to have their own views?
They're allowed to have their own views, but not to have that color their perspective in their work. That's where I draw a fine line and a line in the sand, quite frankly. And there's also other stuff in the report as well about Comey and how he actually was using, you know, personal stuff, private email or private server, etc. So you're seeing it on both sides, and he's actually on the conservative side, actually. So to your point, James, you know,
Yeah, I won't say he's not really conservative compared to today's Republicans.
Right.
He's a Republican, but I think what's interesting is that it reminds me of what reporters get accused of. Reporters get accused by conservatives of being liberal, and that therefore that must mean that our coverage of anything is biased. And we refute that by saying, even if some of us hold liberal views, we're able to put them aside and act like professionals. I think it's a little harder to make that argument within the FBI involving a presidential candidate, someone as prominent as Hillary Clinton, President Trump. It's a little harder to make that argument stick, I think.
Yeah, so the Inspector General report very critical of James Comey for making those very public pronouncements about the Hillary Clinton email investigation. Why do you think he made those public but didn't disclose the fact that President Trump was under investigation?
I think
President Trump.
I think it was because the public needed to know, and he wanted, and he had a moral obligation to tell them. It was relevant information. Whether or not, talking about like whether Trump was under investigation should have been something that he said at the same time, sort of balance the electoral effect is another matter. But I do think that it's important that he made those statements. The public should have known it was important information, and he was exercising his duty.
So shouldn't the Republic have also known that President Trump, or then candidate Trump, was under investigation for potentially colluding with a foreign government?
I think that had there been stronger evidence, or had he had a better reason to believe that it was a moral responsibility for him to tell the public that, then yes. But I think that he exercised his own discretion based on the evidence that he had at hand, based on the status of the investigation, to not tell the public.
Okay. Well, we're going to go to President Trump again now, because also this week he's facing another lawsuit, and this time from the New York Attorney General. Here's the story from CBS News.
The lawsuit filed today says Mr. Trump ran the foundation according to his whim rather than the law. It describes the foundation as little more than an empty shell with a board that hasn't met in 19 years. The complaint cites a series of transactions that New York Attorney General Barbara Underwood says benefited Mr. Trump's own interests, an illegal practice known as self-dealing.
So, Benita Talati, given all the other lawsuits against President Trump, how problematic do you think this one could be?
You know, there's been so many similar suits, right? For example, there's been the accusation about violating the emoluments clause. There's been similar suits. Honestly, the optics aren't that great. Self-dealing, conflicts of interest, so on and so forth. But also, honestly, a lot of charities do engage in similar things. A lot of charitable organizations, well-known ones, actually do take money from people and use it for other purposes instead of for the stated purpose of their charities. So there's that.
They don't use it to run for president.
They don't use it to run for president.
Maybe Elizabeth Dole when she was with Red Cross, I don't know, but no.
And Red Cross has actually been one of them that's been quite questionable, to be frank. But also, there's been a lot of things where charities also form other organizations that are in other names, so that it doesn't look like there's any connection between the two, but there are. And then the other issue is the fact that there's been so many lawsuits. I can't think of any president in recent history that has had as many lawsuits against him and his family as this one. There's just been so many lawsuits. How many lawsuits?
So many women.
So many women.
A lawsuit for every woman. No.
There's that, but I mean, there's also about, and yes, again, conflicts of interest is a concern. It is a very serious concern. So is campaign finance violations. That's also a very serious concern. But it seems to me that it's not just these issues. It's more politically motivated, again, because of the animosity against the Trumps, and not only his organization, not only his foundation, but his family and he himself.
Do you think it is political bias from the Attorney General in New York?
I think that it might be politically motivated, but that doesn't discount the importance of the lawsuit. I think that there are legitimate issues here, and regardless of whether or not the Attorney General was politically motivated in doing this, I think that it's important that he do this, that we should clarify exactly what the law is with regard to with regards to like nonprofits that are being like managed by people who are also like running for office and possibly like using them to support them in their run. And yeah.
So how troubled are you by the fact that the campaign was instructing the foundation sort of when and where and how to release certain monies?
Oh, well, in the grand scheme of things, it really wasn't that much money. I think the total was around 2.8 something million, which in campaign terms is chump change. And it went to mostly veterans like organizations, and these donations were timed to be advantageous to the campaign, ostensibly. That's the allegation, at least. And giving money to veterans for some like good optics isn't the most immoral thing in the world. But like there are legitimate like nonprofit like laws and like regulations and campaign like laws at stake, and I think that's worth like looking into.
How important is the law versus perhaps the optics and public opinion of the Trump Foundation's alleged actions?
I actually think that this is one of the more serious threats to Trump. I think, and I think it is because it's very concrete. It involves groups of people, charities that Americans care about. It involves concrete amounts of money that we can trace, and it was clearly, if what the New York Attorney General is alleging is true, it was clearly completely deceitful. It broke campaign finance laws because allegedly some of the money was used for his campaign. It broke various laws involving charitable foundations. So it's the one case where you're going to have, if it's true, you have concrete acts that were done that were broke concrete laws. And think of how the donors feel. Think of how the donors feel, where they felt that they were. You probably had a lot of anti-Trump donors donating because they thought they were going to help veterans or other groups that they support. Think of how they feel if they find out that when they found out that, oh no, the money actually went to help his campaign.
Because the Trump Foundation's money primarily came from other donors rather than the Trump family.
Yes, and so I think this is going to be hard. I mean, President Trump has shown an ability to skate on everything. The Teflon president. So he may find a way here, but I think this is a threat to him.
Is it that serious, Benita?
It could be serious, but to your point, you really think that anti-Trump people actually donated to the Trump Foundation? People who don't support Trump don't want to do anything involving Trump. So I would highly doubt that anyone who is against Trump is supporting his foundation.
What about James's point, though, that this is a very concrete, visible, tangible, alleged breaking of the law?
Allegedly, yes, it could possibly be. Maybe. There are possibly campaign finance violations. Maybe. But we don't know that yet. The problem is that we're all jumping to the conclusion that this is actually real. This is actually finally the smoking gun that everyone's been looking for to finally go after President Trump and his family. But the reality is it's innocent until proven guilty. Let's let it play out. Let's see how this suit is going to turn out.
Okay, and we will see. It's important to note that it is a civil suit rather than a criminal suit.
Sure,
So
that's true.
Maybe he'll be the first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize in jail.
In jail.
Teasing about that.
Okay, well, we'll move on and we'll take some questions from our viewers now. And we'll start with Christina Tyler, who asks, if conditions in Central America are that bad, then who doesn't qualify for asylum? I mean, a lot of migrants coming over the border saying the threat of violence and crime is what's driving them there. So does everyone qualify for asylum if they come from Central America?
So here's the thing. Anyone who wants to come here because they're in fear of persecution can claim asylum. They can seek it if that is the reason. They cannot seek asylum just because they want to escape their country, come to America, make a better life for themselves and their families. That is the law. The other thing is that if you want to seek asylum, you have to seek it from the first country, the first safe country. So they're crossing through Central America, they're crossing through Mexico. Mexico has offered asylum. That means they have to accept it. Now, listen, that audio broke my heart. It truly broke my heart.
Of the children in the detention facilities?
It broke my heart. It really, like, nothing before. But the fact remains, we cannot have an open borders policy. We do not have the capacity for it. And frankly, also as the daughter of legal immigrants, I have to say that it's not fair to legal immigrants. Now, if you're actually genuinely seeking asylum, of course, you are a legal immigrant. But there are people who are just sneaking across the border. That's not legal immigration.
James Rosen, do you agree? Should anyone from Central America just...
Well, you know, I keep mentioning politics. Maybe I'm in a cynical mood tonight. But, you know, for instance, Cubans who defected routinely, you know, got asylum. There was no question. But one of the reasons was that Cuba was our enemy. To some degree, still is. And individuals coming from other countries where their governments are not necessarily our enemy, they have a higher bar to clear. But I think the asylum law spells out a number of conditions that have to be met by asylum seekers, and I don't think it's that hard to show those. Very interesting point about Mexico. On what basis are you saying that Mexico? Well,
excuse me. Yeah, we're going to move on to our next question, but maybe we'll come to that there. Because it's more of a technical point. Michael, you didn't get to speak up last time. I'll come to you first. And the question comes from Fred George, who asks, before the family separation policy went into effect, if the Border Patrol caught a family trying to enter illegally, what happened to them? I don't know if you have that specific knowledge.
I don't have that
more
specific
technical
knowledge.
Question.
I assume that they were simply detained. I think that one of the reasons that the separation policy was instituted was that people were waiting in these detention centers for longer and longer periods. So, say during the 90s, when somebody came over the border, and they were, I found out, and they were detained, well, then they have to wait for their hearing. So nowadays, that hearing can take months to happen, whereas decades ago, when the influx of illegal immigrants was far lower, those wait periods were also far lower.
Sure, and I think the answer to Fred George's question is that the families, if they were crossing the border together, they would have to be released after 20 days and then would supposed to come back for their hearing whenever that would come up, which is the so-called catch and release policy, which conservatives are critical of. So what do you think should happen now, James? Is it okay if we have the families now, we'll just detain them together, that's fine?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are no really great choices. It's hard. But I think detaining them together is certainly preferable from splitting that up. I think that what's happened this week showed that.
Okay. So now it's time for our regular segment, the most underreported story of the week. And who would like to start us off?
Well, I'll start. I'm a coffee lover, and I drink 2 or 3 big mugs every morning. And there's new research out from German researchers that shows that, and I felt very righteous when I drank coffee because I drank a couple mugs, and that's generally what has been said to be healthy for the heart, other parts of your body. German researchers did a very interesting experiment, and they concluded that actually the best number to aim for is 4 mugs of coffee. And that's the healthiest amount. And what's fascinating is the way in which they arrived at that conclusion. They gave mice the equivalent of what would be us drinking 4, but even more important than that, they actually poured coffee on top of cells, and then they watched what the reaction was, and they found out that in aged cells, older cells, the molecules and the proteins and so forth inside the cells acted like they were younger. So there's now a theory that coffee is really healthy for you.
Great. So a coffee for me on the way home. Benita, what's your underreported story?
So I think the most underreported story is that this week DC voters voted by 55 to 45 to increase slowly the minimum wage for all tipped workers, not just restaurant industry workers, but all tipped workers. I think it's quite significant in this country because it means slowly but surely more and more states and more cities are going to start moving in this direction. It's going to be a trend. It's going to lift these people up so that their wages are actually paid by their employers, not by patrons. Okay,
not much time, Michael Schindler, but what's your story?
So, big story, but it was underreported because of all the hubbub in the news about the separation of families, etc. King Philippe of Spain and his wife came to visit the White House on Tuesday and called it the Great Integrate Trip. They talked about their trade and defense relationship with the United States, especially with black olives, and generally went very well, which is just a nice silver lining to an otherwise hectic week.
Okay. Well, that is all for this week. I'm Adam Byrne. Thanks for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.